it translated as convert, but it's not really a convert. In those days, it was more of the resident alien who lived amongst us, who wasn't um, who wasn't a member of the tribe, if you will, and literally a member of the Jewish people. There was an interesting thing in the for us as Jews was that we understood that there were strangers that would live amongst us, and maybe eventually they would take on our ways, and eventually they'd become part of the Jewish people. But remember, for us, it wasn't just a religious issue. It was one of being a part of the community, being part of the culture, being part of this, being a citizen. So for us today, or for the last 2,000 years, this issue has been one that was really religious. And so the word ger went from being a resident alien or a stranger to being a convert. And so we use the word ger today to describe a convert, when in reality, it really is more of an immigrant or a resident alien or somebody who's not a Hebrew who lives amongst you. Look, the Torah says over and over again, maybe again close to 40 times, that you have to protect the ger, you have to protect the almanah, the widow, and you have to protect the orphan. Those three categories of people were considered to be the most vulnerable because there was understanding that they had very little in the means of protection or help, and so we're obligated to protect them. Again, there was very different times, and there were also interesting considerations there, which are again, that the people would become part of the community. The hope would be that or the expectation, I wouldn't just say the hope, was that they would become part of the community, and that they would eventually take on the practices and the ways of the Jewish community, which is why it developed into conversion. But again, for the last 2,000 years, up until recently, it was not an issue. It is an issue in modern day Israel. And so Israel looks at its laws, including laws based on the Torah, when it comes up with its own immigration policies. And it definitely affects the way we look at it today as Jews. It also affects, obviously, Christians who look at the Hebrew Bible and say, well, what does the Bible teach us? Which is one of the things that the woman that you're talking about, Bud, referred to in her remarks. Look, it was an interesting take because obviously everyone knew that she did it because Trump was there, and it sent an interesting, and I think obviously a controversial message to people. It was definitely going to be a lightning rod issue, so it's going to be a lightning rod issue in the coming days, and I think all of us are going to have to examine what our priorities and what our feelings are on this issue. And most of us do not own farms, and we're not employed in or employing immigrants to do our work. So we have a different take on it than maybe somebody who lives in Bakersfield and runs a farm and has economic need. We definitely have an economic need in California, but again, we can discuss it further. I'll definitely put some stuff together and kind of maybe show you what some of the texts are in the future. But I hope we're on. Facebook. Thanks. So I hope that this will be the purpose of this group. Is and people are asking me. I'm going to have to stop looking at my phone because some people were evacuated. Obviously, our people in Castaic were evacuated, and then. But I can't, we're not going to deal with this now. So people are checking on me, checking on us, checking on the synagogue. We got emails from the Federation, I think they're a little bit more prepared now for, helping out. And so far, thankfully, we didn't need anything. John, texted me a few hours ago saying, do you need to go over and get the Torahs? And I said, well, it's nice that he offered, but I think we're okay for now. We would sleep here. No, but that's one of the reasons why we came. I wanted to be here in case, we were here. People said, well, the evacuation order is going to be in place until 7 a.m. But yeah, it's safe to be here now. And if it wasn't, we'll get our Torahs and go. But I think hopefully we'll be ready. But yeah, as I told you before, all of you, after what I saw a week and a half ago, I'm never going to say Can't happen. Can't happen. I will never say that.
Ra-
So,
Rabbi, if there was a disaster and
yeah.
we couldn't get to the Torahs, where is it like a retail store where you just buy Torahs?
Well, I wouldn't say there's lots of retail stores. You believe it or not, you can get Torah. Well, probably you believe it, but yes, you can get Torah scrolls. Yeah. The problem is that unless you can see the Torah scroll, and this is a very visual thing, you're going to scroll through the whole thing on a virtual call with somebody? Probably not. You want to see it in person. But yeah, there's a couple places in Fairfax. It used to be probably 4 or 5 places. Now there's maybe 2 places in Fairfax. Shalom House, any Judaica store can find you one. They don't have them in stock necessarily, but they could find you one. And same with the House of David. House of David almost always had one in control. What? Still there on Witsit. Or yeah, Witsit. Or
Yeah,
Witsit.
John, it's 5:14 a.m. where you are.
What?
No, I haven't gone yet, Phil.
Oh,
No.
oh,
So
I leave
again,
tomorrow.
to answer the question, you could get a Torah scroll. We could get one in Fairfax. We bought one in Fairfax. The one that the Steins donated, we got it at a what? No, the little one was donated by the Reform Movement. The bigger one we had, the one that the Steins donated, we bought in Fairfax, and the other one we brought back from Israel with Mike. So
Mike Schwartz?
yeah, you did.
Huh?
What?
Mike Schwartz?
No, Mike Atkin.
Oh, Acton. That's right, because it's on the cover, right?
So that Torah was brought back from Israel. That one's really not usable, but we use it. We're not going to stop using it. But anyways, yeah, that in the worst case scenario. I'm actually trying to get a Torah scroll, one of the Torah scrolls that was rescued from Pasadena. I have a connection to it. So it was my great grandfather donated it to the Verdugo. Well, he donated it to Verdugo Hills Hebrew Center 50 years ago because our family was very involved with Verdugo Hills. And that synagogue closed, merged with the Pasadena one, and then that Torah scroll went. There was actually a couple Torah scrolls. So I don't know if they can identify the one that our family donated, but it's been rescued, and I would gladly pay them for it. We'll see. But
Rabbi,
I know they're overwhelmed. What? Yes, somebody else?
does each kibbutz have a Torah or
Does each kibbutz have a Torah? That's an interesting question, Philip. Some of them do. The more religious ones do. Almost every kibbutz has a synagogue, has a sanctuary, Beit Knesset. Some of them aren't used very much, and some of them are religious kibbutzim. Some of the kibbutzim were started by religious Zionists, and those ones, obviously, it's a big part of that. But yeah, I mean, almost every one of them has a Torah scroll. I would say almost everyone. But none of the Torah scrolls, from what I know, were destroyed. Though I don't know for sure, but most of the kibbutzim had destruction. But I did not hear of any Torah scrolls that were burned. That doesn't mean there weren't. Maybe there was, but there weren't a lot of them that would have been like that. So so the purpose and the goal, the objective of what we're going to be doing now is looking at the Talmud, but rather than being bound like we were by doing page after page of the Ein Yaakov, which I was hoping would be a little bit more focused on, or less focused, I should say, less focused on the legality and some of the legal discussions, the halakhic discussions, which for the most part, in the Talmud, they're being discussed, they're being analyzed. And then throughout the rest of Jewish history, for the next 1,500 years, Jews continued to discuss the laws that are in the Talmud and came up with eventually more and more law codes where the laws were extracted from the text. We kind of did the opposite, which was we looked at more of the inspirational text, more of the lessons, more of the what some people would call more homiletical, more sermon-like, more geared towards philosophy and towards things that we can take away on a level that's not necessarily just how do we how do we light Shabbat candles, or how do we, what's the proper way of of in some cases we looked at the blessings, but we really kind of didn't look at the longer discussions about how do we say the Shema, or how do we, what are we supposed to do, at what time of the day can we say at the last minute to say the Shema. We didn't get into those minutia because, quite frankly, those some of those discussions are interesting, and they're also the beginnings of those discussions, but those aren't the ends of those discussions. I mean, you really have to go through the rest of Jewish legal discussions, which go in through the codes, and again up until modern times, where rabbis continue to weigh in on what we call the halakha. Today, we're going to start a new study of Talmud, which is really going to focus on what we kind of did before, but rather than looking at only at one section like we did with Brachot, we're going to jump around and look at a lot of different sections, and we're going to look at the stories from the Talmud that teach us lessons like what we were doing before, but not necessarily in order. Not because, there's obviously something very special about doing brachot, which is kind of why we did it. It's the beginning. It also has a lot to say about every day, the blessings that we say, the beliefs that we have, the values that we have that are part of our prayers. But there's obviously a lot more. And to study the Talmud page by page by page is virtually impossible to do once a week. If you do it once a day, it's called the Daf Yomi. You can do it every day, and it takes you 7 years. And that's hustling, by the way. That's hustling through a page a day. We very rarely did a full page, and a page is a front and back side, so it's really 2 pages. But if you do 2 pages a day, you can get through it in 7 years. That's not doing it on Shabbat, but that's doing it every day. So you can imagine if you do it once a week, it's going to take you about 40 years to do. So that's a tough thing to do. And God willing, I'd like to say that I'd be here in 40 years, but I don't know. It's not looking good. Based on my genetics, that might be asking for too much. So we're going to try to at least throw out there the stuff that I think will really help us on a daily basis, will be relevant to us, and also help us understand where we come from. It is, but it helps me contextualize, kind of like tell people, hey, look, when we look at the Talmud, which a lot of people don't even crack open because they don't know where to start, that there's at least kind of distills some of the essence of it. And we've been studying the Talmud really now for a while, kind of snuck it in there. We did Pirkei Avot, which is a section obviously that we studied entirety, but it's only 5.5 chapters. But and then we went through Brachot, and we, of the 60 or so 60 double-sided pages that are there, the 60 dapim, we went through, probably 35, 40, 30 of them, maybe 40, 35 of them, or at least looked at maybe 35 pages. Didn't necessarily read the whole page. So, what? I'm leaving for Israel on Tuesday. So we're not going to have class on Tuesday or Wednesday next week. The following week, we won't have class Tuesday morning, but we will Wednesday night. So, starting this to, what? No. Well, I'll be back. Yeah. We're only gone until Tuesday morning. I am. So then we'll be away, but we'll get to that. But I wanted to start this now, and I had no idea that we were going to start it while fires were raging around us. And again, then I thought maybe, and Mike Schwartz texted me. I'm like, I think we should still come in, but then I was like, some people were like, well, I'm not going to come in, but I'll join you online. But we said, let's start it, and let's kind of give everybody a taste of what we're going to do. And these sessions, by the way, are going to be closer to like 70 to 90 minutes. We're going to cut it down from the 2 hours to a little closer to 70 to 90 minutes for a few reasons. Number one, rather than having to rush through a page or a text or the Torah portion or some of the other ways that we've kind of created, study sessions, these ones are going to be basic ideas. I'm not sure how long they'll take because, we never know what tangents or what discussions they'll lead to. But rather than have 2 or 3 of them, we'll have like one idea and one thing. And Mike needs to go to, but yeah, what are you talking about? I need to go to bed earlier, or at least I never. It's funny. I never come down. I never go to sleep right when I get home. It always takes me a couple hours to calm down, especially on Wednesday night. So I never go to bed right away when I get back. So tonight, who knows? Because I'll be watching this stuff tonight. But I know you sent me a picture hours ago. You had a good view of it, Mike? You had a good view? Yeah, Mike has an amazing view of the valley. Well, Mike and Mary, but Mike takes pictures all the time. Mike is the one who's out there looking every day. Has beautiful sunset pictures he posts on his Facebook, and today he was scouting the fire. So you saw it pretty clear. Because, I mean, we had weird angles that we could see. So we could see it from like down the street from us, and there were people that were taking picture because we have a place that we go to, like we watch fireworks, which has a pretty good view of the valley. But we don't from our house. Like if you looked in our backyard, you couldn't really see it. But just down the street, yeah, you see it. And it's pretty bad. But yeah, it's a crazy day. But the craziness in the world around us, hopefully through the Talmud, will become a little less crazy. It'll become a little bit more, well, at least help us with figuring it out. And today we're starting with, I think, even though it's kind of like midway through the Talmud, not even midway, it's kind of towards the back end of the Talmud. Yeah, it's from the section. Let me just show you real quick. It's from the section. Let's just look at the Talmud sections for a quick sec. When we look at the sections of the Talmud, these are again originally laid out. The sections are from the Mishnah. There's 6 sections, 6 books of the Mishnah, and then there were the Talmud, the commentary, what we call the Gemara on it, depending on the section of the Mishnah, would have more or less commentary. So Brachot is the only section on the first book of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is, roughly 6 books, roughly the same length. They're not all the same length, but out of that whole book, there's only Brachot, which is the tractate that we read. So in the next section, which is called Moed, the holidays of the Mishnah, you've got all these sections for the holidays, which, by the way, as you notice, doesn't include anything about Hanukkah. There's Purim, and there's Passover, and there's Shabbat. Shabbat's a big one, but nothing on Hanukkah. Too new. There's a little discussion, and we'll look at it maybe next year for Hanukkah in Tractate Shabbat. Yeah. Well, it was there, but it wasn't clearly important during the time that this was written. So we're going to look at it. We're going to look at it in the Shabbat. It's a little reference in the book of Shabbat. And then the next section, 3, is of the Mishnah is family law, Nashim, and you can see that's got quite a lot of sections. It's really about families and about marriage and about divorce. Well, we're going to look at some of them. And then the next one is the 4th section is called Nezikin, the damages, which is really civil law. So this is interesting for lawyers. So this is Bava Kama, Baba Metzia, Baba Batra. Those are the 3 gates, the first, the middle, and the end gate. And then Sanhedrin is about how to create courts. And you can see all those sections of Nezikin, of damages. We looked at that section once, which was about idolatry, Avodah Zarah. We studied that one kind of in depth. Then we get to the 5th section, which is about sacrifices, about the temple, which was already destroyed by the time this was edited, but they thought it was going to come back. So they had all of these sections. And we'll look at some of these when we get to certain ideas, because there are some things that come from these sections of the Talmud, but you can imagine a lot less. And then the next one also was really about things that had to do with holiness and purity in the Mishnah. And there's only one section, which really, in a way, is very connected with the family law, but it's Nida, and it's about impurity, ritual impurity from menstruation. Well, guess what? A lot of that, obviously, is also in this section of Nashim, family law. But then this section does have some stuff in here that we, makes its way into our discussions. So as you can see, these are the sections. This section, some of these sections, again, are more read than others. There are sections that, that some people get to know really well. We actually read from Nezikin, we read a little section that deals with when we read Pirkei Avot. We read from the Talmud too, but today we're gonna read something from Baba Vatra, which is, as you saw, it's the last gate. It's part of the section on Nezikin. In Aramaic, it means the word Bava means gate. Baba. You know that from if anyone's ever seen or talked with people who are what's the word I'm looking for? People who are followers of the it just left my mind. No, I was going to say no. Stop. No, the Baha'i people. They call their leaders, their founders, the Bab, the gate. And so, if you've ever seen that word, Bab, in Arabic or in Farsi, other language, that means gate. So this is the first gate, the middle gate, and the last gate. So we're going to be looking from Baba Metzia, the middle gate. And again, the discussion is really about legal things, and the page that we're going to be looking on to today, 59, was originally discussion. I'll just kind of show you some discussion. It was a discussion about discussion about well, the discussion is always, there's always more than even what I'm going to tell you, but the discussion is about originally is about that we're going to look at is about an oven. That is the discussion of whether it's kosher or not. And we've discussed this before, so we've actually looked at this section before, but I wanted to look at it tonight because it's really the backbone to me of the whole Talmud. It really is, in some ways, the backbone of all of Jewish discussion and Jewish law for the last 2,000 years. When people want to explain how did the Jews get from having a temple where there were priests and there were people that were worshiping with kind of a very standard way, very obvious way of praying and connecting to God, and then they lived in a country where, yeah, not every Jew, by the time the temple was destroyed, most Jews didn't even live in Israel anymore. So there was a huge diaspora, but they knew where the headquarters were. Everyone knew that Jerusalem was the headquarters, even when Jerusalem wasn't under Jewish control, even when it was controlled by the Greeks or the Romans. Everyone knew where the Jewish homeland was. So how did Judaism survive? How did Judaism become a religion? How did it move from being a national religion and a people to a religion? And to some extent, this discussion that we're about to see, this story, is the foundational text for this. And I'm not the only person who said that. I mean, for a long time, people have said that this discussion, if you want to understand conservative Judaism, especially if you want to understand rabbinic Judaism, if you want to understand what we have been undertaking for a long time, what is the difference, to some extent, between Judaism and Christianity? It's this discussion, it's this story that we're about to see. So this is a critical story. And so before we start to look at other things in the Talmud, you can make the argument before this should be the opening story of the Talmud. We started with Pirkei Avot because I wanted you to see that the story, Pirkei Avot, begins with the transmission from one rabbi to the other. And then we kind of looked at Brachot, which is a very good example of, and a very important example of Talmudic discussions. But this really, to some extent, we could have done before we studied Brachot, but I wanted to see what it would be like to open up and just to do it through Ein Yaakov, through the inspirational text from there. But here's the story, and it's called the Tanur Achnai, the oven of Achnai. So again, the original discussion is about an oven, about whether if it's cut into certain, if it's a kind of oven that has pieces in it, like let's say tiles, can it be kosher? or is it not kosher? Because what could happen, of course, is that food gets into the cracks, and it would make the foods that are in there that would be put in afterwards unkosher by the fact that it was still there, that there's impurity in that food, or again, you're mixing, milk and meat. You're mixing foods that have kosher for Passover, that have leavened, not leavened, but that the cracks could kind of make something impure, especially again ritually impure. So the discussion of this oven in particular, Rabbi Eliezer says that this oven was kosher, was pure, and the rest of the rabbis said it wasn't. Now, again, this is a discussion about something that you'd think on the face of it is completely frivolous. But again, this story is held up as, and you can discuss it with anybody who studies Talmud. Anyone will know this story, because this story, more than any other story, encapsulates what the Talmud is all about and what, to some extent, Rabbinic Judaism is all about. The undertaking, the part of who we are that's existed for 2,000 years. So let's dig in. The rabbis deemed the oven impure, and so now there is a discussion. This is known as the oven of Achnai. The Gemara asks, what is the relevance of Achnai, a snake, in this context? Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said it is characterized in the manner due to the fact that the rabbis surrounded it with statements like this snake. So it coiled around like a snake, right? And deemed it impure. And again, it was the fact that they argued about it that made it like that. It was a snake in its coiling. The sages taught on that day, when they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion, but the rabbis did not accept his explanations. They wouldn't listen. And he says, look, it's clearly kosher because this and that and this and that, and we know from here, it's a discussion there. And Rabbi Eliezer, one of the things we know about him is he's brilliant. He's a brilliant scholar. He's very connected. And he's considered, again, one of the leading voices. But the rabbis wouldn't listen to them. And here's the famous part of it. After failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree will prove it. And the carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, which is 150 feet, right? And some say 400 cubits, which is like 600 feet. So the carob tree flew through the air 600 feet. It didn't just jump, it didn't fall down, it flew in the air. And the question of how far it flew, it was a big flight. And you notice that some people are arguing already over how far it flew. The rabbi said to him, one does not cite halachic proof from a carob tree. That doesn't mean anything, Rabbi Eliezer. Carob tree can go flying. We don't decide things from that. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, the stream will prove it. And the water in the stream turned backward and began flowing in the opposite direction. So if you think the tree wasn't impressive enough, I'm going to make the river turn backwards. They said to him, one does not cite halachic proof from a stream. So it means nothing. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it. And the walls of the study hall leaned inward and began to fall. He's collapsing the building around him. Rabbi Yehoshua scolded the walls and said to them, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of halakha, what is the nature of your involvement in the dispute? And the Gemara relates the walls did not fall because of the deference to Rabbi Yehoshua, but they didn't straighten up because of the deference to Rabbi Eliezer, and they still remain leaning. Now, to me, this explains why their building wasn't built right. there was an argument between two rabbis, and the building miraculously started caving in. Not that it was done with bad contractors, but that's why the building was lying. But look, in their minds, the building proved, him, but again, didn't fully prove it. Didn't fully take his way because the other rabbi stepped in, Rabbi Yoshua. It's not done. Story's not done. This is actually nothing yet because of this. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. And a divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer? As the halakha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses his opinion. He's always right. Don't argue with him. He knows it. And he knows it. He's right. God intervened. This is one of the few times in the entire Talmud where it says that God did something in their time. And it's not God doesn't come down. There's no angel. There's no God doing anything other than letting Rabbi Eliezer play with nature, do supernatural things. But God didn't do it. And Rabbi Eliezer, he invoked it. He made it happen. And God just came down. God's voice just got heard by people. And look what they said to God. Rabbi Yoshua stood on his feet and said, it is written in the Torah, right? Our favorite line, my favorite line, Lo bashamayim hi. It is not in heaven. They quoted the Torah back to God. And so what did God do, right? The Gemara asks, what is the relevance of this phrase? It's not in heaven, Lo bashamayim. In this context, Rabbi Yirmiyah says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice, as you already wrote at Mount Sinai in the Torah, after a majority to incline. So God, not only did you say it's no longer in heaven anymore, it's with us, you've told us in the Torah, in the Exodus, that we have to agree with the majority. We have to go along with the majority. Since the majority of rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, the halakha is not ruled in accordance with his opinion. So what did God do? Well, it doesn't say God did anything more, but what did God think? What does God feel at that? Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi, right? Who goes back and forth between heaven and earth. Sometimes he's in heaven, sometimes he's on earth. So he knows what's going on in heaven. He's the one to ask. So he said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, what did God do at that time? And Rabbi Yoshua, again, when Rabbi Yoshua did that, said, Lo bashamayim hi, Elijah said to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me. Now, if you don't understand what the rabbis just said, they just said that we beat God using God's own words. And God looks at us like a parent who finally realizes that his kids know enough and heard the lessons and now stop us with our own lesson. So if anyone's ever dealt with their child, when their child literally turned the tables and said, yeah, but that's not what you do, Dad. That's not what you said. You've said before over and over again, we don't do this. That's what just happened. And God looks at us like children, like God's children, and says, you're right. God said, you're right. Now, the key part of that verse, of course, is that God smiled. Remember, the part that's bold is actually in the text. So the text says, God smiled and said it. Now, if God's not smiling, then God's upset and God's not happy, but it says God smiled. So God was happy with them. God was happy that we understood the lessons of the Torah and essentially used those words to stop Eliezer from, going rogue. Before we get to the rest of the story, the postscript, because the postscript of the story is important. I'm going to share it with you. And some people never get past this part because this is the key part. This is the key lesson. The rest of it's interesting. What happened afterwards? I mean, you want to know what happened. But the key part is this scene, right? And so a lot of times when you see this quoted, they'll just give this scene. They'll say the oven of Achnai, and then it'll end here. That my children have defeated me. It'll finish with that. So if you're teaching this, and I've seen it taught before, just this section, people walk away with just this. And again, I don't know if the rest of what you're going to see is even going to change your opinion, but understand how important this is to us, that we literally have told God, number one, you don't intervene anymore, God. The reason that we don't see, people always ask me, well, why doesn't God do miracles anymore? Why is God not involved anymore? At least within rabbinic Judaism, we have this idea that we're not children anymore. We're not at least little children anymore, where God's going to come in and rescue us. Why? Because we know what we're supposed to do. We're old enough that we've now taken on the lessons. We've learned from experience, and we don't need God to come in and save us or stop things from happening. Now, you could say, yeah, but the Holocaust. Well, the answer that traditional Judaism has is that the Holocaust was perpetrated by people who should have known better, who were schooled in the Torah. I mean, much of it was perpetrated by Christians who were educated. And again, it wasn't a Christian action, but a lot of the people who participated in the Holocaust were Christians who read the Bible. And so you wonder, did they not take in those lessons? Did they not take in the values that at least, and when we read the Torah, we say, yeah, it doesn't seem like you should be killing, mass murdering people. Yeah, we're left with this. We're left with a problem that when we look at the world, we kind of say, God knows that we know better. And that's the difference here. Now, at the same time that the Jewish people are writing this story, Christians are writing a story that's very different, which is that God is getting involved or re-involved with people by having Jesus live and then be killed and then be resurrected, and that God did get involved again to try to fix things and to fix things with Jesus. Now, interestingly, at the same time the Jews are offering an explanation for how are things going to continue now, Christianity offers another possibility. Now, what's interesting about it is that it came out of the same traumatic experience, which is the destruction of the temple, the Roman persecutions during this time, and it came out of the same experience with the same people. Some of the Jewish people followed another path, which was a path that led them to Christianity and developing Christianity. When, again, very shortly after that, most of the people that were following the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of this new church are not Jews anymore. And so they don't understand and would never even have a relation to a discussion like this. But Judaism, and what we call rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism that we follow, took this story to some extent to heart. And that's why I would argue this is a foundational text for understanding who we are as Jews. What is our take on where is God? What is our take on what's our responsibility? What's our take? What do we have to do now? And one of the things that we see is Rabbi Eliezer, we're going to see in the next scene. What happens to Rabbi Eliezer? So whether we like it or not, God is saying we understand it and we got to deal with it. We're taking responsibility. So
Rabbi?
Yeah, but we also, I was going to say, but we also have this issue, which is you have to go along with the majority opinion. And so again, whether or not this is democracy by the terms of like what we would call democracy, we understand that the Torah says in Exodus, and it says it in chapter 23, right after the Ten Commandments are given, that when it comes to decisions that are made in Judaism, we have to follow the majority opinion. whether we like it or not, we follow the majority opinion, which is very interesting because, gosh, today, maybe yesterday, there were a lot of people that didn't vote for the current president. There's a lot of people in our country that were not happy with what happened in the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks, whatever, since the election, and they don't like what's happening in the whatever. They don't like the decisions that are being made. They don't like the executive orders. They don't like any of it. The reality is that we have to, and most people, the vast majority of people, didn't leave the country over the last couple of months. All the people that said they were going to rush off to Canada or rush off to Europe, most of them didn't do it, my friends. I mean, again, did they want to? Have they looked at it? Did they start to investigate it? Maybe. I don't know. But not the majority. And the majority of them definitely didn't leave. So we understand this. We have to some extent, probably, again, for those people who aren't happy with what happens right now, they have to remember that that's part of the civil agreement that we have. And again, I know people are going to say people don't follow that. People didn't do it, 4 years ago on January 6th. I know everyone will pick and choose the way that they're going to interpret history and the way they're going to interpret what's happening, politics as it's happening in real time. But think about that lesson that the rabbis took out, which is, and we're going to see the consequence, you have to follow the majority. And we'll talk about why in a sec. Philip, yes.
My question is, since we have Torah, and once we receive Torah, then we don't really need to have God directly intervening because we have the Word of God. We have God in Torah.
Yep.
So does that mean, I'm wondering, when you talk about the Holocaust, were Jews just not as evolved politically or economically or militarily enough to prevent it or defend themselves, where we today have our own state? In other words, did it take time for us to learn?
It's a good question. So one could say that um, it's difficult to say like all the ingredients that go into history, right? I've thought about it a lot, right? Why wasn't Israel established 200 years ago or 300 years ago or four, like why not? Like the Ottoman Empire controlled Israel for 400 years, 350 years, or 400 years, let's say. And during that 400 years, the Ottoman Empire never really thought that much about Israel. They really didn't. They didn't care. So the whole idea that, it's a holy place in Islam, I don't know, ask the Muslims who controlled it for 400 years because they really didn't do anything with it. They didn't develop it. They didn't create, beautiful, beautiful stuff. I mean, the walls around Jerusalem they built, those are nice, but they didn't like turn it into a major tourist place. And they didn't really do a lot of, they didn't do pilgrimages there. I mean, that's just the fact. But regardless, the important thing to understand is that, okay, but during that period, there were Jews who moved to Israel. There were Jews that came to Israel, but there weren't enough Jews. Come on, like 1700s, we were a bigger percentage of the population in the 1700s than we are today. I mean, after the Holocaust, we lost, 3/4 of the Jews of Europe, which was where most of them lived in the 1700s, right? So we didn't have enough Jews to establish Israel? No, we did. Numbers were there. Part of the reason is it was the alignment of politics and everything else. You bring up this question, Philip, but one of the biggest issues is in the 1700s nobody had an idea of nationalism. There was no nationalism. Nationalism really started as an outgrowth of the French Revolution, the American Revolution. The whole concept of having a nation state didn't really exist. So how are the Jews going to create a polity that could be Israel? You almost had to have the rise of nationalism, which is what Theodore Herzl, came up with these concepts not out of nothing, but out of the nationalism that existed in Germany at the time. Because remember, Germany wasn't really a nation; they had to come up with a national idea of what Germany would look like. There's a bunch of little city, little countries, little tiny principalities. So they had to come up with German nationalism, which Theodore Herzl was very influenced by, and this whole concept of a nation had to happen. So there could be a Jewish nation, but you had to have an idea of any kind of nation before. There really wasn't an idea of a nation. Think about it. You know, you had a king, you had a territory, you had countries, but you didn't this idea of a nation didn't exist. A national identity that you could be a part of if you were a Christian or if you were a Jew, if you were nothing, whatever you were part of a nation. They didn't exist. You and I forget that because we see a map and somebody has a map of the 1300s and you see, well, this was France and this was England and this was that, but they weren't nations. They weren't. So you had to have nationalism in order to have Jewish nationalism. So when people say, like, why not? Well, because there weren't even concepts that you could grasp onto. So people, I don't think, understand that. They kind of look at things and just say, why didn't it happen? So I think that, again, could it have, if it had happened 40 or 50 years earlier, obviously if it happened in the 1900s, which it almost did, if it happened in the 1900s, then maybe we would have had an Israel that Jews could have gone to. But look, in that alternate history, maybe the Nazis would have gotten through El Alamein and they would have attacked Egypt and Israel, and Jews would have been wiped out in Israel. I mean, who knows? History is what we have, right? We have this now. This timeline that we're on, it brings us here, Philip. But I will tell you that when we're here and we live with a world that survived the Holocaust, where we survived, because we're all essentially, every Jew that lives today is a survivor in some small sense of the Holocaust. And we're also Jews who live in the shadow of a modern nation of Israel, that is now a homeland for us. So all of those things being a part of who we are, we say this, how did God manifest in that? I don't know. But we could say we understand that God has said to us, you take care of it now. You take care of it.
I just wanted to say one more thing.
Yeah.
And then I'll stop.
No, please. That's the purpose of this stoppage right here, was to have this discussion. And anyone else who please jump in if you have something to say.
What I find interesting with my Christian friends is that they don't really understand, and I'm not blaming them, but they don't really understand the relationship that I have or Jews have to Israel, even though I'm not Israeli, and my family didn't, my family immigrated from other places, although one relative was born here in the United States, but I think that the majority of Americans don't fully understand why Jews have this relationship. And I think it's not just religious. I think it does have a lot to do with the pogroms and the Holocaust, and even, well, for modern Jews.
No, of course, and I think that to some extent that's one of the things that we learned, was that we have to take care of ourselves. That's the lesson from the Holocaust, right? So yeah, just remember that all of that goes into the modern nation of Israel and the answer. But one could definitely say, as we have since this discussion of Achnai, that this is up to us. This is our responsibility to take care of this, which is not, it's not easy. When you're an adult, it's not easy. There's a lot of us that I think would like to go back to being children, and I think Jesse's here today. He's the youngest person by far in our group right now, and he's the closest to being a child, though he's he's an independent guy, but I think when you're younger, you really understand, oh my gosh, I'm not that far away from having everything I need taken care of for me. So I think that's one of the reasons why, Jesse, it's hard. It's hard to take on some stuff, because it's easy when God is taking care of you, or when our parents are taking care of us. It makes it oftentimes very easy. So I want to tell you, this discussion, and to me, that's one of the things that I see in the Torah. When people say, well, why does God intervene for the people in the Torah? They're very childlike. You know, you see the way the people behave in Exodus and in the when God is doing these things for them, they become completely dependent on him, on God, and they also act like children. And so when we see, you know, some level of responsibility, there is this freedom that comes with that and this independence. And what's interesting is that, at least from our vantage point, the traditional vantage point of Judaism, that's what God wants. You know, if God is was a one of these kind of sick, you know, mentally kind of stunted parents, where you want your kid to constantly be dependent on you, then it would be different. But God doesn't seem to want that. God wants us to be able to make the decision and to basically say, yeah, we're in control now. God, you've given us this world. Now we're going to take responsibility for it. So
So,
it's
so,
a very bold um, um, assertion.
so
Again,
God stopped being a helicopter parent, right?
yes, exactly. This is God saying, yeah, I guess you got it. You really understood it. And again, it also shows us that God was intervening when the miracles were happening and the carob tree was flying and the stream was turning back. I mean, that's God. I mean, that was God helping out Rabbi Eliezer. Eliezer is invoking God's power to do these kind of things, and God's allowing supernatural activities to happen. God's allowing the system to be upended by what Rabbi Eliezer is doing, because he has that power and he's so powerful, Eliezer, that he's like a superhero. he's he's the rabbis do these things, and again, it shows you that, you know, not one person had this power. Other rabbis had the power. You know, Rabbi Yoshua had the power, and so did Rabbi Eliezer. So, you know, and Rabbi Natan can see Elijah. Not we, you know, I don't know. I'd recognize Elijah. Rabbi Natan does, you know, and Elijah talks to him. I mean, how many people get to talk to Elijah? You know, Natan gets to speak to him. So the rabbis do some amazing stuff, right? They're doing stuff that, you know, by the way, if they're doing this kind of stuff, and you're going to see a story in the next part, it sounds a lot like the stuff that Jesus was doing. Maybe that's one of the reasons why it wasn't so far fetched, because rabbis are doing these things, or at least they're telling, or people believe they're doing these things. I'm just telling you, a lot of those stories that you see in the Christian Bible or that you've heard of, rabbis were doing them too. You're going to see it really very obviously in the rest of this story. Any other comments or points? Because this is really I won't say this is the climax, but this is really the part that is the crucial part. I mean, the other rest of it I want you to see, because it also teaches us some stuff. But this is really heavy duty. And as I said, some people just end here. But since we have some more time, we're going to read the rest of the story. But everybody gets it, right? Everybody understands what just happened here. The phrase that when God speaks, it's called a bat kol, which literally is kind of like, it means like the voice. Well, it's like the it's a bat kol is it's about it's about as much as God's going to manifest in our lives is a heavenly voice. That's the way we hear God in this world, is through a bat kol. And again, we have to always use the Torah as our proof text, even when we're saying to God, you got to back off. I quote the Torah. So those are the lessons. The two quotes there, Lo bashamayim he, and after the majority you incline, right? The phrase in Hebrew is achrei rabim lahatot. Those two phrases, to some extent, are the underpinnings of Jewish discussion ever since the Torah, but when the Talmud codified it here and brought it in as the proof text. These are the proof texts. So, what happened? What were the repercussions here? Consequences. The sages said, on that day, Sages brought all the ritually pure items, deemed pure by the ruling of Rabbi Eliezer, his previous rulings, right, with regard to oven, and they burned them in fire. And the sages reached a consensus in his regard and ostracized him. They excommunicated him. So they burned his teachings and they excommunicated him. Now that's some heavy duty stuff. That's some heavy duty stuff, because what they just did was they kind of wrote him out. They said, he's done. That's pretty heavy, because they're not going to talk to him anymore, and they're not going to even have, there's no record of him anymore. Well, now, of course, there is, because we have this story and we have other things that we have quotes on. So we don't necessarily have quotes or discussions about, we don't listen to him on what's pure and what's not pure, but we still have stories about Rabbi Eliezer. We still have teachings from him. But at least when it comes to this subject, we're not going to listen to him anymore. So it's not like he totally was expunged, but it's heavy. But who's going to tell them this? The sages said, who will go and inform him? Rabbi Akiva, the same guy that we read about last week, who was martyred, was killed by the Romans. This was his teacher. So when is he living? This is about 100, the Common Era. This is before the Bar Kokhba revolt, maybe 15, 20, or 15 years before. So it's about 120. So this is around the time of the, as you said before, this is a little bit before gladiator times, in between the times of Vespasian and the Colosseum, and when the Bar Kokhba revolt backfired on us, but pretty close to that. Pretty close to that. So Rabbi Akiva is his student, right? And Rabbi Akiva loves Rabbi Eliezer. He loves him. So Rabbi Akiva is tasked with going to tell him. He says, I will go, lest an unseemly person go inform him in a callous and offensive manner, and he would thereby destroy the entire world. Now, that's what it said. He is going to destroy the world. If the wrong person tells him, he's going to go on a rampage. He's that powerful. And so let me tell him, I'll stop, I can stop this from being a disaster. What did he do? Rabbi Akiva, he wore black. He wrapped himself in black as an expression of mourning and pain, and he sat before Rabbi Eliezer at a distance of 4 cubits, which is about 6 feet. So he gives him his space, right? He doesn't sit right on top of him, but he sits, just outside the kind of the zone that, you give somebody his private space. But he comes, he's not standing on the other end of the room, but he's in front of him in a safe distance, if you will, right? And you're not supposed to, of course, be any closer to somebody who's been ostracized. So it's just at the border, right there. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, Akiva, what is different about today from other days that you comport yourself in this manner? Why are you like this? What's going on? You're kind of staying, a little far away from me and maybe looking in a certain way. You're wearing black. You look maybe not very happy. What's going on? Rabbi Akiva said to him, my teacher, it appears to me that your colleagues are distancing themselves from you, which of course is not what happened. They distanced him from them. But he says it in such a way that it's a euphemism, right? So he doesn't say they've thrown you out. They say they're staying away from you. Not that you're going to not come anywhere near them, but they're staying away from you. So when he hears that, Rabbi Eliezer too rent his garments, removed his shoes, as is the custom of an ostracized person, and he dropped from his seat and sat upon the ground. So Rabbi Eliezer realizes that he's essentially, he's dead. He's dead to them. He's the one that he's essentially mourning. He's mourning his own. He's mourning his own what we call harem. It's his own excommunication. He's been excommunicated, right? So he's it's horrible. I mean, it's literally your community is now turned on you, and you can no longer be part of the community. The Gemara relates. It says, his eyes shed tears, and as a result, the entire world was afflicted. 1/3 of its olives were afflicted, and 1/3 of its wheat, and 1/3 of its barley. And some say that even dough kneaded in a woman's hand spoiled. The sages taught there was great anger on that day, as any place that Rabbi Eliezer fixed his gaze was burned. Yeah. So you can see telling him was not good for the world. And if Rabbi Eliezer hadn't been told by Rabbi Akiva, if Rabbi Akiva wasn't the one bringing him the news, it could have been a lot worse. So this was a horrible thing. It's a horrible, horrible thing because this great rabbi was excommunicated. And we know that God liked him because God was essentially arming him. God let him do these miracles, these supernatural events. The guy has power. There's no question he has power. And God hasn't taken away his power. God didn't take away the power because God's not involved. God's letting people make the decisions. So the guy's achieved that power. And you could say, well, God armed him in the first place, so why can't God take it away? But because he got this power on his own. Rabbi Eliezer achieved this because to some extent, if God takes away the power, then God can take away the power from anybody. If you've achieved this power, if you have this kind of level of power, the only way to counter the power is to have somebody else who has a similar power or more power deal with you. Look, there's a very interesting discussion in the Talmud, which maybe we'll look at, about Jesus. The rabbis never, there's not a lot about Jesus in the Talmud, I want to tell you. We can look at it in one day and you'll see it all. But there's this interesting discussion in the Talmud where Jesus is confronted by the rabbis and they tell him, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. Now, we have no version of this, obviously, in the Christian Bible. And we don't even know that, again, this was not an imagination of what they wanted to have happen, because we don't know of this anywhere else but the Talmud. And they basically have to confront Jesus and counter his miracles or his wonder working with their own wonder working. So you can't, God won't strip Jesus of these powers. They have to go into battle with Jesus on their own, which they do. So it's a very interesting thing. They're not even going to deny that Jesus had those powers. They're just going to say they had to be dealt with, which is similar to what happens here. So I'm not saying that that's the way the rabbis thought everybody was, but they weren't going to deny that other people had power, because essentially if the person earned that power, had that power for whatever reason, however they got that power, they had it. God wanted them to have it. Or God allowed it to happen, whatever you want to say. So you better counter that power with other power. All right. That's a little reflection on what the rabbis thought about these kinds of supernatural occurrences when they happened, which obviously is not off. But now watch how this story gets very personal. Rabban Gamliel, even Rabban Gamliel, the Nasi of the Sanhedrin at Yavne. So this is again somebody we've heard about before. Rabban Gamliel is from the Hillel, the family of Hillel. He's from the dynasty of Hillel, and he ran the Sanhedrin. He was the head rabbi of the Sanhedrin, which was still in power at that time, right? They still convened a Sanhedrin at Yavne, which is near Tel Aviv today. And he's really the guy in charge. Now, whether or not he was there when the initial event happened at the original argument, that's not the issue. He's the one who has to kind of give his say over this kind of thing. I mean, he's in charge. He's the guy in charge. So whether he was there that day or not, in the first place, it doesn't matter. He's the one in charge. So it says Rabbi Eliezer, right, was coming home on a boat at the time. This happens, right? When everything goes crazy, when Rabbi Akiva tells him, right? Coming home on a boat, and a large wave swelled over him and threatened to drown him. Rabban Gamliel said, "It seems to me that this is only for the sake of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, as God punishes those who mistreat others." Rabban Gamliel stood on his feet and said, "Master of the universe, it is revealed and known before you that neither was it for my honor that I acted when ostracizing him, nor was it for the honor of the house of my father that I acted. Rather, it was for your honor, so that disputes will not proliferate in Israel." In response, the sea calmed from its raging. Why do I say this is very Christian or reminds us of the Christian thing? Because we know the story of Jesus on a boat in the Galilee, where there's a storm raging and Jesus calms it down. Now, that doesn't necessarily exactly the same story. I didn't say it was. There's a lot of similarities to this, which is that look what Rabban Gamliel does. He stops the sea from raging. With his powers, he counteracts the powers that are manifesting because of Rabbi Eliezer. So it's one guy versus another. Again, that's not necessarily the story in the Jesus story, but it shows how Jesus intervenes to create like a little mini miracle. Well, that's what happens here. And if you notice, whether or not the rabbis knew the story of Jesus at the time, and we don't know this, by the way, we don't know, for us to understand that the rabbi who might have written this story even knew much about the story of Jesus on the Sea of Galilee, we don't know. So I'd be very careful to say that this was a response to that. I don't know that it was. Was it written after the story of Jesus? Yes, probably, but not much after, and we don't know. We don't know. We don't know if it was written 100 years after, 50 years after, if the person who wrote this even knew about Jesus. But there's an interesting message here for early Christians and for Jews who are debating whether or not Christianity is a different religion now, which is God, we are going to do what it takes to stop disputes from proliferating in Israel. We need to stop people from going off the rails. So to some extent, the rabbis here are saying we don't want people to leave to kind of start their own stuff because they're right. Even if they are right, we can't have people splitting up the community. So for the sake of communal integrity, we're going to stop people by ostracizing them and by making them make sure that they don't have the wherewithal to split up the community. Now, why doesn't it make sense? Well, yes and no, because if you send the message that if you go rogue, that you're going to go it alone, then you're basically saying to anybody else, hey, if you leave the community, don't count on any community support. We're not allowing you to take any part of the community with you. Anybody who goes with you, they're going to get ostracized too. It never happened. Now, the reason that Christianity succeeded, right? It didn't succeed, right? There weren't enough of them. Correct. No, exactly. So Jesse is saying if you can't hear them, what about the Essenes, right? What about these other groups that were around during that time? Well, most of them didn't survive the destruction of the temple. The Sadducees didn't even, there was no temple anymore. But their whole mission, the Sadducees existed as a group, as a separate group. They couldn't survive. So none of these groups survived. There were later groups that were breakaways, like the Karaites, who broke off of rabbinic Judaism. And there were, there's an argument that if Reform Judaism or other forms of Judaism had left the sphere of Judaism as a whole, that they wouldn't survive or exist anymore anyways. That's one of the reasons why Judaism has worked so hard. I mean, some people have worked so hard to create communal integrity where we can all say, hey, we're still all Jewish, but it's tough. It's not easy. It's not easy. There are certain red lines where we say, yeah, but this is part of Jewish communal integrity, and we have to work at it. Yeah, in America. So one of the important things that we have to keep in mind is that a lot of the rabbis who are writing these stories, right, the ones who were writing the story of Rabbi Hyrcanus, they might not have even lived in Israel. Some of these stories proliferated and were retaught in Babylonia. What's interesting about that is that many people think that all of the stories that talk about Jesus were not even written by rabbis. We don't have any discussions of Jesus in the Mishnah, which is the older part, the part that would have been closer to when Jesus lived. Again, the Mishnah was finished around 200. The Mishnah was in a complete form by about 200 of the Common Era. There really are no texts about Jesus, and there aren't in that. The later part in the Gemara, there are texts, but those are ostensibly, some of them could be written 300 years later. And more importantly, even if they were written 200 years later or even 100 years later, they might have been written by Jews who lived in Babylonia. Well, what's interesting about that, of course, is Babylonia was not Christian. There were Christians who lived in Babylonia 100 years later. There were nascent Christian communities there, but for the most part, they were Zoroastrian. And those Zoroastrian communities and those people that lived in Persia were at war with the Christians because who was their main enemy at the time? The Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines and the Persians were fighting over not necessarily the land of Israel. That was pretty solidly part of the Byzantine Empire at the time, but the Zoroastrian Persian Empire wasn't too far away. They were fighting more over like modern day Syria. What is Syria? That's where the borders were. They were fighting all the time. So it could be this postulate. The theory is that Jews who lived in Babylonia and under the Persians tried to prove their allegiance to the Persians by making fun of Christianity, and making it very clear that that has nothing to do with us. Which they wanted to say, hey, yeah, okay, Jesus was Jewish, Christianity broke away from us, but it's not us. And we're not those people. We're not the Byzantines. And so some people think the Jews went out of their way to denigrate Christianity or denigrate you. And there's not a lot in there, by the way. Again, there's not much in the Talmud about it at all. But any of it that denigrates Christianity was not written by Jews who really had any access or any interest or any real conversation with Christians. And on the contrary, they didn't want to make Christianity look good because they wanted to make sure the Persians knew they weren't like them. So just keep that in mind, that any of these discussions could have been written by people who really had no interest or really had no knowledge of Christianity. It's hard for us to imagine that because we live in a Christian country, a predominantly Christian country. But Jews didn't always live in predominantly Christian countries, and so they had other political objectives. And sure enough, sometimes Jews fought with Muslims against Christians. They did during the Crusades. You talk about when the Crusaders came through Jerusalem, Jews weren't fighting with the Christians. They were fighting against the Christians. So, history is what it is. And and it's a lot harder for us to maybe imagine it, but the whole concept of like, well, how's Judaism different than Christianity wasn't an issue necessarily on a deep level to our ancestors. Definitely the people who wrote the Talmud don't seem to get it. They don't really seem to be that interested, and they don't seem to spend much time discussing Christianity as a force because, again, it's not relevant to them. So in a weird situation, they do talk about Zoroastrianism. They talk about the faith of the home country that they lived in, and they're very careful not to speak out against it, even though it's very different from their religion in some ways. But they worried about assimilation to Persian stuff, and they worried about how many Persian customs would seep into Judaism. I've told you before, the holiday of Purim is there because of the Persian influence. It's hard to understand Purim without understanding the Persian holidays that it was borrowed from. Much as it will be hard 200 years from now or 300 years from now to explain to Jews that many of the customs we have at Hanukkah are because we celebrated Hanukkah in a Christian land and started taking on Christian traditions, like giving gifts and putting up big lights around our house. Those are those were us, those are the cultural influences. So understand they still happen. These are still things that are happening. They happen in different ways today, or different, different. They manifest differently. But if you're a Jew in Israel, you don't have a lot of knowledge of Christianity. Believe it or not, Jews in Israel, they don't know about Christianity the way you and I do. They don't really get it. It's just not relevant to them. So they don't understand those same kinds of discussions that we have when it comes to, like, how is Judaism different than Christianity? They don't ask that question. It doesn't come up. When every one of your friends is Jewish, and it's very rare that you're going to meet a Christian on a daily basis, and when you're 14 or 15 years old, by the time you're that age, how do you even formulate that kind of question? They're not interested in it. It's interesting, by the way. It's hard for us to kind of get out of that mentality, but they really don't. There is, but it's so marginalized, and it's so strange that when you see it, and you know how Jews react to it in Israel, that they look at it from a different way. I mean, in some ways they're more hostile to it than we are, but they're also, they also kind of, they also don't take it that seriously. In another way, they're also like, what are they going to do here? They're not having much influence. So, and when they do, it gets, when people start seeing that Christians are having too much influence, it makes them really uncomfortable. So it doesn't happen a lot. And by the way, there are Christians who move to Israel to evangelize Jews, and they wind up becoming Jewish. So it doesn't always work the way they think it's going to work. But yeah, there's people who convert to Christianity in Israel. I've met them. I know some of them, but it's not something that they're worried about on a regular basis. But yeah, it's difficult for us to imagine because we're just so conditioned. You'll never, an American Jew who grew up in the diaspora will never understand what it's like to be a Jew in Israel. You'll never understand it. We can't. It's a different mentality. So back to this issue, and back to the story and how personal it is. Look at this. The Gemara further relates that Ima Shalom, that's her name. She's known as Ima Shalom, which means mother of peace. That's her name. Ima Shalom was the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, but she was also the sister of Rabban Gamliel. So her brother excommunicated her husband. Wow. Understand how people found themselves on different sides of debates and tore up families. What do we see? What does she do? From that time forward, so ever since the incident on the water, she would not allow Rabbi Eliezer, her husband, to lower his head and recite the Tachanun prayer, which includes supplication and entreaties. They're special prayers. The Tachanun are special prayers that we do on certain days that are, you'll see people when they're in synagogue, they'll lean on their hand like this and pray Tachanun. And it's deep prayers of asking God really for forgiveness and for pouring out our hearts. But she worries that if she allows her husband to do this and to really pour out his heart, bemoan his fate at that moment, her brother would be punished. So if Rabbi Eliezer really gets into the Tachanun, her God's going to hear the prayer. The power of her prayer is going to kill her brother. A certain day, it's around the day of the new moon, and she inadvertently substituted a full 30-day month for a deficient month, which is a month that only has 29 days, right? She didn't know what day it was. She thought it was the new moon, when one does not lower his head in supplication. So it was a day that she thought there was no Tachanun, but there was. She was wrong. She miscalculated. So some say a pauper came and stood at the door, and she took bread to him. So some people say she just was distracted at that time, but it didn't matter. The result was that she left her husband momentarily unsupervised, and he prayed Tachanin, full with all his heart. When she returned, she found him and saw that he had lowered his head in prayer. So she was looking down, and she said to him, "Arise, you already killed my brother." She knew. She knew the power that he had and what would happen. Because, again, she heard the sound of the shofar, or they heard it, emerge from the house of Rabban Gamliel to announce that he had died, the Nasi had died. Rabbi Eliezer said to her, "From where did you know that your brother would die?" And she said to him, "This is the tradition that I received from the house of my father. All the gates of heaven are apt to be locked, except for the gates of prayer, and specifically, prayer for victims of verbal mistreatment. I knew that you had the power because of the way you were treated by my brother, that if you prayed, it would cause his death." Rabban Gamliel was a good man. He was a powerful man. He was powerful enough to stop the sea from raging. But the power that somebody had in prayer, and specifically someone who had been wronged, was enough to cause this power to be unleashed, for him to be killed. So you can see she ends up losing her brother because of this. And one of them was going to, one of them was doomed to some extent. And she, I guess you could say, she was willing to deal with the being the wife of someone who was excommunicated. She didn't want her brother to die. It's not like she wanted him punished for it. But they knew that this was out there. They knew that this had happened. They knew that the consequences of this could be that someone was going to die. So this is not a minor thing. Having a dispute within the community is a major issue. Having someone be ostracized, being excommunicated, is a heavy issue. Now, their question hangs out, and again, the rest of the discussions are that has to do with mistreating people. And in particular, by the way, of course, it translates to the convert. To get back to what Philip says, what's interesting is if we understand that this word ger should not be convert, but should be the stranger who lives amongst us, which already by the time of the Talmud, it's starting to be a convert, right? It's starting to be somebody who actually goes through kind of a religious conversion to be part of it. But it basically says that somebody who does this, who mistreats a convert, can be punished. This is all off of this discussion of somebody who mistreats, anybody, somebody else. I mean, in this case, obviously one of the rabbis, but it also goes for even somebody who is powerless as a convert in your community or a stranger in your community. So you better not verbally mistreat anybody. But you can see the power that would happen if you verbally mistreated somebody who God's listening to. So God's power gets unleashed in strange ways by people, and we have to be careful. It doesn't say that like Rabbi Eliezer wanted to kill Rabban Gamliel. It doesn't say that, but it didn't matter. Once his prayer is heard, it's going to go out and do it. So the question was, did Rabban Gamliel, did the Sanhedrin have to excommunicate Rabbi Eliezer? Was there another way of doing this in such a way that maybe he could have been, his power had been minimized, but that wouldn't have happened? It's a difficult question. I mean, the story definitely lends itself to the possibility that the rabbis overreacted, that they didn't have to excommunicate them. They didn't have to excommunicate him. They could have said, well, we're not following his decisions anymore on ovens. But look, there's a big issue. If the community splits off in different directions, we got a problem. Judaism won't survive. And so the story is a cautionary tale. It's one to remind us that you better be very careful not to create in the communities, schism that would allow for
people to, essentially destroy somebody else, and literally, kill somebody. This is not a minor issue, because we know that schisms in the church accounted for millions of deaths. The way somebody interprets, a biblical passage, wound up having Protestants and Catholics kill each other until not too long ago in Ireland. It's more complicated than that, right? It's not just a matter of what church you went to. There's other cultural and political issues there too. But yeah, religious differences within one religion, within one faith, are serious issues. And Judaism tried to prevent this from happening for the most part. For the most part, there are examples of strange sects that started. There's the famous story we've talked about of Shabbatai Tzvi, who created a whole messianic movement in the 1600s and attracted thousands of people, actually, before he went up in smoke. And there are cases where Jews fought against each other, physically over disagreements. There were Hasidic movements that would sometimes break away from another one, and there'd be fighting. There are little fights that are going on around us that we usually we're not privy to, and it's not really part of our world. But for the most part, the Jewish community has not, on a religious level, gone to war against itself. Now you could say, well, there aren't that many of us. Well, that's true. That definitely helps. We're persecuted from the outside. That helps too, right? Being persecuted from the outside keeps us a little, the integrity of the group a little bit tighter, because we say, well, we can't destroy ourselves because they're destroying us, and we better work together. So there's a little bit of that, obviously. But there also is this understanding that we have to maintain some type of integrity that will survive, but only through consensus. Ironically, and I would say kind of, we're really seeing, and this is kind of where we're going to end today, the issue of what brings Jews together today as a consensus is an interesting issue, because there's definitely things that we agree on, and there's other things we don't agree on. But up until the last year, my friends, one of the things that the Jewish community agreed to was Israel. There was a consensus over that. There's other red lines. Look, we have these discussions all the time. And I've shared with you that, look, I have my own red lines, and the Jewish community has lines, and you have a line. And, one of the lines that kind of existed for a long time within the Jewish community was Israel. The other one, of course, is, again, at a certain point, people who become Christian, it's not like we're going to throw them out of the community, because we don't. I don't ask. I don't drill down to what people's beliefs are, whether they have, Christian beliefs or not. Comes up. It's come up a few times, but it's not a question that we ask. But as a community, we don't, for example, if we have a Jewish community event, the Jewish community in the United States, and to get to Jesse's point, in Israel, does not recognize Jewish Christians as part of the community. Doesn't mean we have to hate them. It doesn't mean we have to treat them like garbage or be abusive of them. They sometimes are in Israel, by the way. I will tell you that you do not want to, you got to be careful in Israel, because there are people who have been beaten up, and there's been cases of things not going well for Messianic Jews in Israel. But in the United States, if you have a Jewish festival, like we are in a couple weeks, right? We're having our Israel festival. If the Jewish Messianic group decided to have a booth there, we're not letting them have a booth there. They're not going to. They didn't ask us. I just happened to have met a couple of days ago at a funeral. They're not coming. They're coming, but they're not going to have a booth. We're not going to stop somebody from coming in, but we're not going to let them set up a booth. So there's a red line there. There's a consensus in the Jewish community on that. Will there always be? I don't know. I'm never going to be one to say, I know the future. something could happen. Yeah, messianic. Yeah, yeah. You can still call them Jews for Jesus. I don't care. I mean, those are all labels. Again, we don't dig down. I don't. They call themselves messianic. Yeah, they don't call themselves Jews for Jesus. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, some people do, but they don't use that term anymore. They don't like that term. Yeah. Well, again, there's people who've been doing it for a long time, but today, people who are involved with that, they'll call themselves, actually, sometimes they won't even call themselves messianic. They'll just say, I'm a Jew who believes in Jesus. They won't call themselves Jews for Jesus. Yes, you're right. They'll sometimes call themselves a completed Jew. But the reality is that, again, as much as we never ask somebody when they come to the synagogue, what is your belief about Jesus? As a organization, we would say, hey, and the same thing that the conservative community and everyone else, you're not coming in as a group. If you want to come individually, by all means, we're not going to stop you from doing that. But we're going to say as a community, that's a red line. And up until recently, one of the red lines was Israel. And we would say that we're not going to have an anti-Israel group set up shop at a Jewish community festival. Well, first of all, if they came to the Israel festival, which we're worried that there are going to be people, obviously, who are going to come who would start a problem, that's why we're having security. That's an issue, right? That's something that we would expect. But at the same time, that festival in particular, we wouldn't have somebody who was anti-Israel having a booth there. But if we had a Jewish community festival, would we let somebody who was a Jewish Voices for Palestine have a booth there? No. The consensus has been no. What will happen in the future? I don't know. I talk to my kids a lot. And my kids, they're part of a generation where this is a crucial issue, where they have friends who were raised in Zionist, you know, thoroughly Zionistic homes where they went to, some of the kids even went on birthright trips, that they are hostile to Israel now, openly hostile to Israel. They're still maintaining their Jewish identity. And again, in a not so famous, I would say infamous incident at High Holidays 3 months ago, someone stood up at the back of the synagogue and said at the end of Yom Kippur, what about the Palestinians? The person was wearing a tallis and came into shul. I never saw the person before. I haven't seen them since, but they were there. So what's going to happen in the Jewish community 20 years from now? I don't know. But up until now, up until recently, that was a red line for the Jewish community. The consensus by a lot was we support the existence of a Jewish nation. It's still the vast majority. But will it always be a vast majority? We don't know. We would hope, I hope. Have there always been Jews who were anti-Israel? Yes. For 75 years, 76 years, and before Israel was created, there were a lot of anti-Zionist Jews. As a matter of fact, the Reform movement was hostile to Israel. The Orthodox movement was hostile to Israel. The conservative movement was one of the only movements that was more Zionistic. Were there Reform Jews that supported? Were there Reform Jews that supported Israel? Absolutely. Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver of Cleveland, of Tiferet Israel in Israel, Tiferet Israel was a very passionate Zionistic advocate. Were there Orthodox Jews who supported Israel before the establishment of the state? Absolutely. But they were a minority of voices. For the most part, the Orthodox Jews said, we're not supposed to force the hand of God and create an Israel. That changed. Most Orthodox voices today, most Reform voices are all in favor of Israel. But will that continue for the majority of Jews? I don't know. If you ask my children, they say that it's going to be tough for their friends to have that feeling. Look, I don't know. One of two things will happen. Either the Jewish community, well, really three things will happen. The most likely is that some of those people will evolve. Their feelings about Israel will change as they grow older, and they won't be as hostile to Israel. That's one possibility. I hope that's the possibility that will happen. That's one possibility. The other possibility is, and by the way, that because people's politics change, right? And so that could happen. The other possibility is that the Jewish community will change as a whole, and the Jewish community in America will eventually become more anti-Israel. It's possible. That's a possibility. There's another possibility, which is that those people who've taken themselves out of the Jewish community's support of Israel will be taken out of the Jewish community. Meaning, those people will no longer feel welcome within the Jewish community. Correct. But we don't know for sure what will happen in the future. We don't know for sure what will happen. But one of those three things will happen. And again, up until now, even people who were anti-Israel when they were in college sometimes come around and they're not as hostile to Israel as they get older. I don't know. I don't know if that'll happen. I don't know. I don't know if the traditional, what had been the trends, would continue that way. I don't know. But if either of those other two scenarios happen, the Jewish community potentially could get even smaller, or the Jewish community, and also obviously even more Zionistic, because that'll be the red line that essentially will decide whether you're part of the Jewish community or not. Or the Jewish community will be fundamentally different, and that Israel will not be an important part of Jewish existence in America. Those are the two obvious possibilities. If there's going to be, like, if someone's going to say, come back, they come back from 50 years in the future and report to us what the Jewish community looks like, those are the only two possibilities of it being different. Is it going to stay the same? Maybe. I don't think so. But that first possibility, where it just continues the way it's been. Well, that's the other issue. So with intermarriage, and more importantly, just general apathy and the lack of religious observance, the interesting question is what happens? So my guess is that an interesting realistic possibility is that people use whatever Zionistic integrity that Reform and Conservative Judaism, American Judaism, maintains. We call it American Judaism, right? Because I think it's American Judaism. I don't think it's Reform or Conservative. I think it's American Judaism. If American Judaism retains a Zionistic taste, if you will, a part of it is who we are as Jews. And I'm not just saying this because I hope because I hope it retains that. I hope it doesn't go off the rails and become anti-Israel. But here's what I think will happen. People will, and they're already starting to do this. So I think this is what happens. To get to Mike's point, I think what happens is that people use the elements of Zionism that are in Judaism today, American Judaism today, and use that as an excuse to distance themselves from the community, a community that they were already going to distance themselves anyways. So yes, it's partly happening through assimilation and through marrying out. But more importantly, it will be used as a basis as an excuse for saying, I don't really want to be part of that community. They're all Zionist. So I think that's what's going to happen. People use it as a convenient excuse because, of course, if they really wanted to maintain their Judaism, they'll find a way to do it. And there are very, some of the expressions of anti-Zionism have come from people who are trying to still stay Jewish at the same time. They're davening, they're doing Jewish practices. But I think they're going to find that, like, it's such an integral part of who we are as Jews today that they're not going to find a whole lot of. I don't think it's going to survive. I don't think Judaism without Zionism survives. But who knows? I think that the reality is they'll just take themselves out of the community, and those people will just exit faster. So that's what I think will happen. They'll use it as an excuse to distance themselves. That's my guess. That's my guess on human behavior and what happens in other groups. And what happens, it's already kind of happening. So that's what I think will happen. But yeah. So not only is this important for our history as we wrap up today, but it's also important to understand our future, because I think this discussion of not so much the part about God intervening, but understanding that there's a community that we're a part of, that the majority of us have a certain belief or certain values as Jews. If that doesn't hold up, then we're done. We're doomed. So I believe that's the case for our future. And I would also say, on another level, it also, at the end of the day, it's going to decide the future of our country. Because if we can't agree on certain basic principles, we're not going to survive as a country either. Wait till we have the first Jewish president. That's Mike's answer. Well, it'll be interesting. It'll definitely be an interesting situation. I'm hopeful about the Jewish community. I'm not spelling doomsday at all. I believe that Judaism can actually thrive and continue to thrive in this country, but it really is going to be a question of we have to get over this hump of right now of defining ourselves as people who are committed to certain values and articulating those values and articulating why those values are important. And gosh, I mean, unless I'm a part of a complete delusion, there are a lot of people who are not just, I mean, some of them are Jewish, I already said, anti-Zionist Jews, but there are a lot of people in this country and a lot of people in the world who are on the wrong side of history. And I really believe that. I really do believe that if they don't get it, and I hope at some point they get it. I hope at some point it doesn't become what I think it could become, which is a war with jihadi and fundamentalist Islam on a global level. But I don't think they understand that they're on the wrong side of history. Just like there were socialists and communists who were on the wrong side of history on that issue. There were people who supported Jews who supported Stalin, Jews who supported communism in the 1920s and 30s, and they were on the wrong side of history. And there were a lot of them. Some of them were in your family, my friends. If you scratch the family tree, you might find a few people who were pretty red. Not because they were wrong, because they just, I mean, they were not bad people. They were just part of a movement that their friends were a part of. They were doing it for, in some cases, really good reasons. Yeah. So I firmly believe that those people who wound up being on the wrong side of history there will again, in the modern era, the people who supported, this the people who are standing with Hamas right now. I don't know.
Rabbi?
Maybe I'm completely deluded, but how do you not see it? The fact that these people right now are celebrating, the end of this war, which to me is a complete disaster for them, as a victory. I say to people, really? You think this is a victory? And you support them? And you think that this was genocide? Well, they seem to be celebrating right now, my friends. This genocide that you called this a genocide, you called this a genocide? Well, they seem to be celebrating it.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Yeah, let me just give you my view of the problem here. And the problem is we don't live in of the 40s or the 50s. We live in a nuclear world. And there was a scene in the movie about Golda Meir where she basically says two things that, if they were true, really struck me. One was she instructed her assistant to kill her because she wasn't going to be taken captive. And the other scene in the movie was she said, we're going to use our nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And I don't think people understand that. And people think, oh, that would never happen. And my comment is, well, why wouldn't it? Nuclear weapons have been used before. Well, atomic weapons have been used before, and that was by the United States. So
Yeah.
the precedent is there, and I don't think people, it's almost too horrible a thought to discuss, but Israel is a nuclear power, even though they don't admit it. They are, and that's part of all of this.
Yep. Well, let's hope it doesn't get to that. Definitely, let's hope it doesn't get to that while we're visiting. But
No, but what I'm saying is, when the Iranians say we have a
Yeah, yeah.
one bomb solution
Yeah.
to destroy Israel, I
Oh
don't.
yeah, I know. That's why I said I hope it doesn't happen while we're there, and I mean they don't have it yet, and I hope Israel doesn't have to respond with a nuclear weapon. But as you said, it's happened before because the United States used an atomic
I
weapon.
always talk about precedents because you have to look at history, and people said, oh, when the Navy SEALs killed bin Laden, oh, that never happened before. I mean, yes, it did. It did happen before. The United States intercepted code, knew where Admiral Yamamoto was going to be, and we targeted, really for the first time, a foreign enemy officer purposely, and we shot him down and killed him because of Pearl Harbor. We never intentionally targeted a German general or, to my knowledge, any other Japanese officer in that way. If they happened to be there, yeah, but we didn't say we're going to kill.
No, I know what you're saying.
We're going to kill General Rommel, and we're going to figure out where he is, and we're going to go after him. That never happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, the United States has targeted, and so when people said, "Oh, that was the first time," I said, "No, it wasn't."
Nope. And now, as you've seen, Israel has done it many times in the last year. So, yeah, I mean, it's actually if in some ways, it's a very humane way of dealing with this. So, yeah, we'll see what happens in the future. And again, I'm most concerned right now with well, obviously with the survival of Israel being paramount, but the survival of the Jewish community in America, the integrity. There's too much that's still up in the air. But like I'm hopeful, but I hope we remember these lessons, which again are, yeah, God's not going to intervene, and we've got to do the work, but also that we have to maintain. We have to maintain this understanding that we have to work together with a consensus. And like I said, I hope we remember that as a country too. So let's hope and pray that the coming days will be good ones for our country and good ones for the Jewish community. And again, we're going to do our part. Thank you everybody for being here tonight. And we won't see you next week, but we'll be in Israel. And as I promised John, we're going to do some study next week in your honor, without you, unfortunately, but we'll do something relevant to Israel. Again, we hope
without me, I'll be there.
Yeah, I know you'll be there. I said you'll be there. So,
yeah, that didn't.
And thank you guys for being there. We'll be thinking about you guys, Schulmans, and the fact that you got to be there with us 2 years ago. That was 2 years ago this time that we were here. Hard to believe it was 2 years ago. It's been some unbelievable times. All right, folks, we'll study in a couple weeks. We'll be together in 2 weeks. If not, again, we don't see you. We'll travel safe, and we hope you travel safe too. So take care, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.